Hey, party people. This is the conclusion, the concluding remarks is the actual title of it, but these are the concluding remarks from James D. White's Marx and Russia, The Fate of a Doctrine. Like all the things I've been reading, I'm not particularly focusing on reading like entire books, just reading excerpts that I happen to find interesting. Um, so I don't know when I might read through this entire book eventually, but I might never do that as well. Um, But this is just going up as its own piece. So, and I'm reading this before I've read a lot of the chapters in the book. These are the concluding remarks, but I'm kind of like trying to jump ahead, see what James D. White's general comments about Marxism and Russia are, or Marxism in Russia. Well, I guess it's Marx and Russia is the title of the book, so I guess I should say that. What his final conclusions are about Marx and Russia, the fate of a doctrine. In her day, Mrs. Thatcher was fond of referring to the Soviet Union as a, quote, Marxist state, end quote, and the implication that Marx was responsible for all the infamies perpetrated in the Soviet era. But was she right? Does Marx carry the blame for the crimes of Stalinism? For what we have seen from the history of Marxism in Russia, there is very little continuity between Marx and Stalin, but that is not to say there is none. Terminology such as, quote, class struggle and, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, provided justification for the use of force throughout the Soviet period. Otherwise, the evolution of Marxist thought in Russia is a progressive distancing from the Marxist ideas that had first entered Russia in the 1870s. As we have seen, the evolution was intimated by Marx himself. His interest in Russia and Russians' interest in his ideas came at a time when Marx was revising his original plans for his, quote, critique of political economy, end quote. He was eliminating the Hegelian framework and revising fundamentally his initial conceptions of how capital circulated and reproduced itself on an expanded scale. Marx never succeeded in completing his project, and when he died in 1883, he left an ambiguous intellectual legacy to his followers that was subject to a variety of interpretations. A more conscientious literary executor than Engels might have left the second and third volumes of Das Kapital in their unfinished state, but not implied that the problems Marx had encountered and worked on for over a decade did not exist. He might have published selections from the Russian material with Marx's annotations, as Kovalevsky and Chuprov had suggested. Maxim Kovalevsky, who lived from 1851 to 1916, was a jurist and the main authority on sociology in the Russian Empire. Maxim Kovalevsky was vice president in 1895 and president 1905 of the International Institute of Sociology. Maxim Kovalevsky also held a chair in sociology at the Psychoneurological Institute. Kovalevsky was elected into the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1914. The Russian Sociological Society adopted his name in 1916. So, that's Kovalevsky and Chuprov. Alexander Alexandrovich Chuprov lived from 1874 to 1926. Was a Russian Empire statistician who worked on mathematical statistics, sample survey theory, and demography. Chuprov was born in Mozalsk, but grew up and was educated in Moscow, where his father, Alexander Ivanovich, 1842 to 1908, a distinguished economist and statistician, was a professor. Alexander Alexandrovich graduated from the Physico-Mathematical Faculty of Moscow University in 1896 with a dissertation on, quote, the theory of probability as the foundation of theoretical statistics, end quote. Chuprov spent the years 1897 to 1901 studying political economy in Germany, in Berlin, and Strasbourg. Chuprov's doctoral dissertation, supervised by Georg Friedrich Knapp, who lived from 1842 to 1926, Die Gemeinschaft eine morphologische Untersuchung was published in 1902. The most important result of his stay in Germany was his friendship with the statistician Ladislaus Bortkiewicz. On his return to Russia, and in order to get a teaching position, Chuprov completed master's examinations at the University of Moscow, concentrating on theoretical economics and the application of mathematical methods. Chuprov started teaching at St. Petersburg Polytechnical Institute and was in charge of teaching statistics until 1917. Chuprov used to go abroad regularly to work in foreign libraries. In June 1917, Chuprov went to Stockholm to the Statistical Bureau. Chuprov was away from Russia when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred. Chuprov intended to return, but first illness and then money problems prevented him. In January 1919, he would become director of the Statistical Bureau of the Central Union in Stockholm and in charge of its publication, Bulletin of World Economy. In the middle of 1920, Chuprov moved to Dresden, where in complete seclusion he wrote furiously. In 1925, Chuprov took up an appointment with the Russian College in Prague. The following year he died. So that's Chuprov. Back to the text. Engels might have published selections from the Russian material with Marx's annotations, as Kovalevsky and Chuprov had suggested. That would at least have pointed Marx's successors in the right direction, and showed that Marxism was a work in progress and not a finished system. After 1868, Marx had been intent on eliminating the Hegelian element from his economic writings. It was misleading of Engels to imply that his own preoccupation with updating Hegel's philosophy of nature was one shared by Marx, and was the basis for Marx's theoretical works. The theory of knowledge which Engels attributed to Marx in his pamphlet, Ludwig Feuerbach, was not the one which underlay Marx's economic writings, and was not one from which the concept of, quote, commodity fetishism, end quote, could be derived. It was not Engels but Bogdanov who, like Marx in his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, held that the distorted view of reality which gave rise to, quote, commodity fetishism, end quote, arose from the fragmentation of the individual in civil society that the division of labor had brought about. Like Marx too, Alexander Bogdanov saw the solution in a society in which people would not be trapped in a single role, but engage in a variety of activities according to their inclinations. Sieber was quite correct in seeing in Engels' anti-Düring nothing beyond contemporary scientific thinking. But his opinion was used by Plekhanov to argue that Sieber did not understand, quote, dialectics, end quote, and so to discredit him. Plekhanov's rise to prominence and Sieber's early death were causes that prevented a commentator on Marx, who by rights should occupy a unique place in the history of Marxist thought, from being better known. An important insight of Sieber's was the ability to distinguish in Marx's writing what was central to his thought and what was the embellishment of Hegelian terminology. His judgment on this was given Marx's full endorsement. Had Sieber's commentary on Marx been given the weight it deserved, the acceptance of Plekhanov's conception of Marxist philosophy as, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, would have been impossible. It is for this reason that the rise of Plekhanov necessarily involved the eclipse of Sieber. Lenin's What is to be Done represents a major breach with a basic principle of both Marx and Engels, which is that the, quote, emancipation of the working class is the affair of the working class itself, end quote. You all know what Lenin's What is to be Done is. It is significant that the two men took the principle so seriously that they declared that they could not cooperate with people who openly stated that the workers were too uneducated to emancipate themselves and thus be freed from above by representatives of other classes. The entire history of the Bolshevik Party is an illustration of the wisdom of this proposition. The pretensions of a group of intellectuals to know what the real objective interests of the working class might be, in face of the expression of the concrete demands of actual workers, is the definition of tyranny. Trotsky perceived this in 1904, when Trotsky warned of the dangers of, quote, substitutionism, end quote, a warning which was fully vindicated by later events. By that time, however, Trotsky himself was an active participant and apologist for the same, quote, substitutionism, end quote. An important break in any continuity there might be between Marx and Stalin was made by Bukharin, when he denied the existence of the categories of capitalist political economy in the Soviet state, arguing that Marx's economic ideas did not apply to the emerging socialist system. This idea was reinforced by Stalin's pronouncement in 1924 that Leninism was the Marxism of the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution. The ideology of the Soviet state was thereby held to be Leninism rather than Marxism. Following Stalin's, quote, revolution from above, end quote, in 1929, which determined Soviet policy was the personal will of the dictator. A characteristic phenomenon in the evolution of Marxist ideas in Russia is the generation of a historical mythology. This begins with Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach, whose account of the emergence of Marx's ideas is at variance with contemporary evidence, including Engels' own early writings. Plekhanov is the arch-spinner of historical mythology with his creation of the, quote, narodnik, end quote, current of agrarian socialism. His intellectual ancestors were Alexander Herzen and Chernyshevsky. I can't remember Chernyshevsky's first name. Nikolai Chernyshevsky, that's it. And prior to them, the Slavophiles. Wikipedia says Slavophilia was a movement originating from the 19th century that wanted the Russian Empire to be developed on the basis of values and institutions derived from Russia's early history. Slavophiles opposed the influences of Western Europe and Russia. Depending on the historical context, the opposite of Slavophilia could be seen as Slavophobia, a fear of Slavic culture, or also what some Russian intellectuals, such as Ivan Askakov, called Zapadnichestvo, Westernism. Back to the text. This myth was the first debunked by Mikhailovsky, who had been classed as a, quote, narodnik, end quote, by Plekhanov, but rejected the label and denied that any such current existed. What was Lenin's revolutionary theory? What was the insight that Lenin had that led him to believe that socialism in Russia was possible? We know from Lenin's writings what this was. It was the Hilferdingian idea that, because the banks controlled industry, it was sufficient to take over the banks in order to have the basis for a centralized socialist economic system. Because this idea did not work, Hilferding and his ideas disappeared from Soviet discourse, and Stalin declared Lenin's revolutionary theory to be that, quote, the chain of imperialism broke at its weakest link, end quote. There was also a change of emphasis when dealing with Lenin's leadership in the Bolshevik Revolution. It became less on Lenin's theoretical pronouncements and more on the actual process of taking power in October 1917. Would have been a relatively uneventful and peaceful accession to power in Petrograd was portrayed a decade later in the Einstein film as a major military operation. It is symptomatic, however, that there were more casualties in the making of the film than there had been in the actual event. Yeah, I've heard that before as well. Trotsky's most famous works, The History of the Russian Revolution and his autobiography, My Life, were both written in exile, with the acceptance of the Lenin cult. The materials in the volumes of Trotsky's collected works, published in Moscow in the 1920s, are also selected to give a pro-Lenin gloss on Trotsky's literary output. But Trotsky's earlier versions of the theory of permanent revolution, particularly in his book 1905, show him as a thinker who bases his ideas on a much better grasp of Russian economic history than Lenin did in his book Development of Capitalism in Russia. For Trotsky, the role of foreign capital in the Russian economy is decisive, and it is the dominance of this capital which determines the weakness of the Russian bourgeoisie and its liberal aspirations. This is true in 1905 and applied just as well in 1917. Only political considerations made it necessary for Trotsky to modify the introduction to his book, The History of the Russian Revolution, in deference to Lenin. The culmination of myth-making in Stalin's short course. The culmination of myth-making is Stalin's short course. Is not history but politics in a historical guise. Is a work in which every sentence has been hammered out to achieve the desired effect. Stalin's short course's purpose is to give legitimacy to Stalin's rule, and every alleged historical event is held to be a step leading towards the regime that had emerged by 1938. Moreover, the short course did not exist in isolation. Every textbook, every monograph, every collection of documents published for the next 30 years or so had to conform to its interpretations. So the short course could not be challenged by independent research. Even more pernicious was Stalin's doctrine, enunciated in his letter to the journal Proletarskaya Revolutsiya in 1931, that there existed in history certain axioms that could not be questioned. That's translated as Proletarian Revolution, and it was a Soviet historical journal published in Moscow between 1921 and 1941. In a review of the first issue of Proletarian Revolution, Ilya Vardin reported that the journal is declaring, quote, "Our goal is precisely to help the writing of the history of the Proletarian Revolution in Russia. Nobody will read documentary raw materials except the historians themselves, and we need books that will be read by both workers and students," end quote. Back to the text. This is a doctrine that effortlessly destroys history as a discipline, and no doubt this was Stalin's intention. There are no axioms in history. There is no historical, quote, "fact," end quote, that cannot be questioned. This is especially true in Russian and Soviet history, where the influence of ideology on historiography has been so great. In these circumstances, there is particular need to approach accepted versions of events critically. To do this, it is necessary to have an understanding of what the political and ideological considerations were that determined a given historical version. It is to be hoped that the present work will go some way towards raising awareness of the ideological element in Russian and Soviet historiography, and by doing this assist in overcoming its influence. That's it. Thanks for listening.